Hey, it's the Questioning Christianity podcast. I'm Dr. Rob Helton, and he's Dan McClellan. This religious scholar once said, "Ooh, baby, do you know what that's worth? Ooh, heaven is a place on earth." Belinda Carlisle said that.
Yeah.
We're talking about heaven today. And we'll see what we can get into here. I encourage you to go back, if you haven't, or if it's been a while, go back and listen to episode 24, which is entitled Gospel. And in that episode, we talked a great deal about the notion of this ticket to heaven and how we need to kind of change our perspective of heaven as being this far off place in the future and change it to this idea that Jesus talked about where heaven is here and now, is coming into earth.
Yeah.
But we never did an episode on like, well, what about that heaven that people most people think about?
Yeah.
The one that's far off.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
So I thought we'd give that a shot today.
Sure.
What do you think of when you think about going to heaven or what heaven is like? What comes to your mind?
Well, I guess I think of the idea that I grew up with. That's my knee-jerk reaction, going to a place of bliss.
Those are the kinds of images that come to my mind. This idea that there would be no sickness and no suffering, and it seemed like there'd be an awful lot of singing involved.
Yeah.
I like the first part. I like the
Yeah.
But the singing forever seems a little boring. There's a lot of mansions talk and streets paved with gold, and none of that really appeals to me too much.
All those things they're not exactly untrue on some level, but I don't know that they're the whole truth about heaven either.
Okay. Why do you say that?
Well, we have this idea about heaven that comes to us probably more from the Greek philosopher named Plato than from the New Testament. Plato believed that basically the body was a bad thing. The eternal part of us, the spirit, has to sort of shed the body, and then that spirit lives on somewhere. And so we have been much more influenced by that idea. Most people think about heaven as, when I die, my spirit goes up to this place called heaven, and that's where I'll be forever, and sort of floating around somehow in this blissful state. And that is sort of maybe a half-truth, part of the truth, not all of the truth, I believe.
I got a couple of questions. One, is it a real place?
Mm-hmm.
And two, is it going to be awesome or is it going to be boring?
Yeah, well, I think, yes, it's a real place. Probably not real the way that most people think about it being real.
I'm hoping so, because I don't like the idea of singing all those songs.
And if a person stops and thinks about this image of heaven that we've been given, I think the only conclusion that you can come to is that it does sound kind of boring, but I believe if we think about it more from a perspective that's consistent with the biblical revelation, I believe we can shed the boring part of it too.
That's encouraging.
Yep.
All right. And make sure that you guys chime in and let us know what you think about this topic. We'd like to know what you think heaven's going to be like, and you can add those comments to our website, questioningchristianitypodcast.com. below this episode on that page, or you can do that on our Facebook channel or page. I don't know if it's called a channel, facebook.com/questioningchristianity. All right. So you said the phrase biblical revelation.
Yeah.
And I think revelation is important because it implies that this is something that develops over time.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning.
Okay.
Was there always a sense of this idea of heaven or even of there being an afterlife?
Yeah.
When did that start?
Yeah, good question. We do have very ancient accounts of the idea of heaven, but not heaven as a place where their disembodied spirits go to. But heaven, way back, particularly in Judaism, was considered to be the abode of God. They had some very concrete thinking about heaven, and there was a lot of diversity within this idea. Basically, the world was kind of this three-tiered idea. There was the first tier of heaven, which is the sky, what we look up and see in the daytime or at night, sun, moon, stars, clouds, that sort of thing, like a bowl that was on top of this flat world. You can imagine this in your mind, this ancient idea of a flat world and this bowl on top of it. And above the bowl was the second level of heaven, which was the waters above the heavens. That phrase you'll see in Scripture sometimes. And that was the storehouse of waters. That's where the rain came from.
Okay.
And then above that, there was this third tier, the third heaven, And that was the abode of God. And heaven, as the abode of God, was the place where God's will was done perfectly. Jesus taught us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. God's will is done perfectly in heaven. But that was one reason why it was believed that people couldn't be there, because anywhere people are, the perfection gets way screwed up.
Yeah. Okay. So what was this abode like then? Just God lives there and angels and like...
Think of it as a king in his court.
Okay.
His attendants.
And the common folk couldn't go in there.
Common folk couldn't be there. And by the way, there is a progression of thinking here. And so part of heaven was also this place where this individual known as Satan could show up. And the word Satan means accuser, or a term that we would be more comfortable with would be something like district attorney. It was his job to show up in court and accuse the people on earth. For instance, in the book of Job, he shows up on that level when God holds court. Satan's there.
Is this idea of holding court, I mean, is this all completely figurative, or is this something that these folks literally thought took place?
I think it was very concrete for them, but I also believe that maybe more than the modern Western mindset, I think the ancient mindset had this capacity to hold these things in tension, to think of something very concretely, but also know, on the other hand, that this is bigger than we can understand. These are all ways that we have of explaining or talking about the unknowable.
It's not like our way of thinking where it's got to be one or the other necessarily.
Yeah, we have this strongly Western kind of mindset about things that we believe, everything's nuts and bolts and it fits one way, and that's what they call a post-enlightenment way of thinking. Our brains tend to not work like people in that ancient world. They told stories. They said, imagine an old Jewish grandfather sitting around a campfire telling these creation stories and stories about heaven to his grandkids around the campfire. And they weave these stories together. And it wasn't that they were trying to sit down with a science book or something and say, oh, look right here, this is how the molecules come together. No, they were telling stories, not so that the kids could understand the workings of the physical universe better, but so that they could understand this entity called God. Is that being good? Is that being evil? And so when the Jews told these stories about God and heaven and creation and these things, they were unique in that they told about a being that was essentially good and did right, as opposed to the ancient pagan pantheons that were full of gods that did all kind of weird, mixed up, messed up stuff, and people were very, very terrified of them.
Okay. Well, I think that's helpful, and I think that's important to call out the idea of how these stories were told and interpreted. We kind of think of it like, well, let me go on YouTube and watch a video about how to fix my washing machine or something.
Yeah.
And the grandfather around the campfire is not telling a story about the washing machine.
Exactly.
It's a different way. So I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. So to me, that's helpful. So as they're thinking about this abode of God, we've got angels, we've got this courtroom, an accuser character. But what we don't have in that idea of heaven are people.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So where did we get this notion that we might end up in heaven?
Well, that's a ways down the road yet, to be honest. I think maybe the first question is, how do we develop from this understanding of God being sort of distant to a God that can connect with people at all? Remember now, the creation story of Israel is this God who walks in the cool of the garden with his creation, but then the created beings screw up and there's this distance between them. And the question is, what's going to happen about that? Is God going to give up on humanity, or is he going to do something else to sort of reestablish this connection? And that tends to lead into this understanding of the temple. The children of Israel are not forgotten. They're eventually led out of slavery. And the first thing that they do when they're led out of slavery is that God gives the leader, Moses, a design for, at first, a tabernacle, sort of a tent, a movable temple. That's where the God of heaven will connect with his creation once again, not like it was in the garden where there's complete open and unashamed fellowship. It's more shrouded and it's more restricted. The Spirit of God comes and kind of hovers over the mercy seat. It's this point at which heaven sort of comes down and connects with earth.
Okay.
Later on, Solomon builds a permanent temple. It's the first permanent temple in the nation of Israel. And Solomon definitely understands this idea. He builds this temple, and then in the dedication ceremony, he has this really long prayer. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. But
Solomon's prayer is in Corinthians?
I'm sorry, did I say Corinthians?
I think so.
Well, that was totally wrong. First Kings. Why did I say Corinthians?
Look at me. I'm paying attention.
I'm so proud of you, Dave. So Solomon's praying this long prayer, and he says this. It's an interesting phrase. He says, he's talking about God and this temple that they've built for his dwelling. And then he says, but will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple that I have built? There's this tension here. There's this idea. Solomon he's wise. Mm-hmm. He has this advanced understanding of God. He says, I built you this temple. I believe you're going to meet us here, but I'm not so naive to believe that this is going to be the house you live in. You know, even the highest heaven, this abode of God, can't contain you. So Solomon is understanding this idea that God is bigger than everything that we've thought of so far about heaven or about earth or about this temple where God's supposed to meet with human beings.
Gotcha. So God is through this tabernacle at first, and then through this permanent temple, he's jumping through the water layer, yeah, and he's connecting down to earth. So there's a doorway between heaven and earth. Yeah, and that's at the temple.
And we get glimpses of this even as far back as like the patriarch Jacob. On his way after he leaves home, he camps out and he's sleeping using a rock for a pillow, if you can imagine that. And he has this dream, and in the dream he sees a ladder, and he sees the angel of God ascending and descending. This just back and forth, between heaven and earth. I think there's some old spiritual song called Jacob's Ladder.
Yeah,
we're not climbing up the ladder like the song says. In that scenario, it's God coming to humanity in his vision, in his dream. But the question that I think that you're wanting to get at, it's not so much about this ancient understanding of heaven and where's God, but what happens to us after we die. And that's what everybody kind of wants to know about heaven.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't you tell us?
Well, and this may sound foreign to those of us who sort of automatically think about, people either going to heaven or going to hell when they die. But ancient Israelites didn't believe that. They believed that there was this place, is called Sheol in Hebrew, or Hades in Greek. It was under the earth. It's the pit, is another way that the ancient poets would describe it. Everybody who died, their spirit, their shade, in a sense, maybe their ghost, goes into this place called Sheol. It's not an attractive idea for anybody. Nobody's anxious to get there. It's a place of kind of nothingness. It's a place where there's no real knowledge of God or this world. And so in the Psalms, sometimes the psalmist write about it. Let me see if I can find maybe a couple passages here where the psalmist will pray to God about this place called Sheol. Most of the time, it's when they feel like their life is being threatened. Or
that's what I was thinking. That I can just hear phrases where I cried out from the pit, or something like that. And
exactly. Or I was slipping into the pit. And that sort of thing.
So that's the idea of Sheol.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And here's one of those places. He said, I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. Lord, my God, I called to you for help, and you healed me. You, Lord, brought me up from the realm of the dead. You spared me from going down to the pit. It's like the psalmist possibly kind of recovering from a near-death experience or sickness or something like that.
Okay.
Later on in the same poem, he says, to you, Lord, I called. To the Lord I cried for mercy. And this is his cry. What is gained if I am silenced? If I go down to the pit, will the dust praise you? Will it proclaim your faithfulness? In other words, if I'm in Sheol, I'm not going to praise you from Sheol. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm not going to do anything that brings you glory from the pit. So it's this whole idea that it's this place where you really don't recover from.
Gotcha. Before you flip the page, just where was that passage in case somebody wants to go back
Psalm
and check it out?
30.
Psalm 30.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's several, but another one I just sort of pulled up today as I was thinking about this. Psalm 88 is another place. The writer says, I'm overwhelmed with trouble, and my life draws near to death. I'm counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm like one without strength. I'm set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. This place, Sheol, it's not at this stage the sense that this is a place of torment, but it is a place of separation from God. They're cut off from the giver of life.
Okay.
And it's sort of just this limbo existence.
It's not something anybody is looking forward to. There's not a lot of whatever the equivalent is of Southern gospel songs about going to Sheol one day.
Yeah, when the roll is called down yonder. There's nothing like that.
Well, and so down is important. So we've painted this image of these different levels of heaven, and then Sheol is the place, the afterlife for humanity, and it's down below. So it's a very, I don't know, kind of depressing sort of image, because I assume, I guess, everyone who dies goes to this Sheol, regardless of whether or not you might be considered a righteous or an unrighteous person.
Exactly. And that becomes the dilemma, the problem that leads to sort of the development of thought. As a caveat, just let me say, I believe that this progression of ancient thought, or the way that understanding developed, I'm not ruling out the work of the Spirit of God in any of that. I think when we talk about the inspiration of like the scriptures, we're taking nothing away from that when we talk about how in ancient Israel and then later on in Christianity, these ideas formed and took shape and developed and built on one another. I believe that the Spirit of God was at work in and through that whole process and guided that process, which in my opinion is inspiration. Mm-hmm. Okay. But I do believe we have to acknowledge that these concepts, they don't just come fully developed. These things grow over time and develop in the ancient world and the ancient mindset.
Sure. Any idea, any relationship has to develop. It's a process.
Sure.
So I think if we think about it in those terms, it's much easier to understand. I guess my question is, at this point in history, would the Hebrew people think about the fathers of their faith, like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Would they think, well, they're in Sheol right now?
Yeah, you've got this one collecting place.
Yeah.
Of everyone who goes on. And there was this development of an idea that surely the righteous people who die don't end up sharing the same place with the unrighteous. And so there developed this idea and this understanding that the righteous are still not, going up and sitting around God's throne, but they are going to a different holding place. And you might think of it this way. Some people write about it this way, that the underworld, Sheol, sort of got divided up into different chambers. Mm-hmm. And on one side was what was sometimes called paradise. You may remember when Jesus was dying on the cross, he said to the thief, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." That's a very Jewish thought. There's this place for the righteous dead where they go and they live in bliss. It's kind of the best version of the underworld's idea of the Garden of Eden. And it's also called Abraham's bosom. So you mentioned Abraham and the righteous. They go to this blissful place. But then on the other side of it, then there's this place of torment where the unrighteous people go. Now we see this picture most vividly in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the New Testament. It's in Luke chapter 16, if you want to look at that sometime, where Jesus tells about this rich man who dies, and in Hades, in Sheol, some translations will say in hell. When Jesus used the term hell, he used the Greek term Gehenna, which was this valley outside of Jerusalem that were trash burned all the time. That's not the term he uses here. He uses the term Sheol. The rich man lifts up his eyes in Sheol, being in torment. But then across this great gulf that he can see across is the poor man, Lazarus, who died and ended up in Abraham's bosom.
Okay.
In paradise. Now, by the way, as a side note, there's nothing unusual in this story for the original hearers of the story when Jesus told it about these two places. These have become fully developed ideas. Nobody was surprised that somebody could die and go to torment and another person could die and go to paradise. What they were surprised about is that the two people who went, they ended up in the wrong place. They were supposed to switch places.
Okay.
In other words, people had the very, very strong idea that if you were rich and well-fed, it was a sure sign that you were blessed by God and that you had gained the favor of God, and so you were for sure going to end up in paradise. If you were poor or lame or a beggar, that was a sure sign that you were cursed by God and you were for sure going to end up in torment. Well, Jesus told the story. The big surprise was that he reversed that, and the poor person ends up in Abraham's bosom and the rich man goes to hell.
Gotcha.
So,
all right. So we've talked about like the ancient Jewish idea of the afterlife, and now we're up to Jesus, and he's not telling the story to describe to us what heaven is like. That's just kind of the context of this greater message that he's teaching, I think.
Yeah.
Where do we get this idea that we've grown up with? The songs about, crossing the River Jordan and the streets of gold, and this is and being in heaven. And so you mentioned the verse where Jesus says on the cross, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." I had made that a note to ask you about, because to me that seemed like Jesus saying you're going to be in heaven with God, but the way you just explained it, that's not the case. My mind is really blown right now. Maybe it's just me, but this is the first time I'm hearing some of this stuff, and I just find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Where did we make that jump to the stuff that you and I grew up with about glory land?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're still working through the tension and the dilemma of this. For instance, take the thief on the cross. So Jesus says, "Today you'll be with me in paradise." But 3 days later, Jesus is up walking around. So, so where's the thief? Jesus does not live in a vacuum. Jesus, this person who died on the cross, was a Jewish person who grew up in a Jewish world, and he talks the Jewish understanding of all of these ideas. And so when he says to this person down on the cross beside him, "Today you'll be with me in paradise," he's definitely talking about this Jewish idea. But it does leave then, especially later on, the Christians who are understanding that the kingdom of heaven is coming to earth, but then their friends and loved ones are dying and what's happening to them and all that. It leaves all these questions sort of open, and the Apostle Paul steps into that empty space and tries to address some of those questions.
Okay.
And Paul's sort of forging theology for us that becomes part of the biblical revelation. Along with these ideas of afterlife that we've talked about was the deeply held Jewish belief that there would be a time when God would reestablish this connection with humanity and set up his kingdom on earth, and that there would be a great resurrection. When Jesus goes to the grave of Lazarus and he tells Martha Lazarus will live again, she says, "Yeah, I know. At the last day, at the resurrection, I'm a good Jew. I believe that." And that's when Jesus says, "No, Martha, I'm the resurrection and the life. This is what I'm telling you." That we're not talking about a resurrection where everybody gets beamed up to some place. We're talking about God coming to earth. The dualism in the Bible is not between heaven and hell. It's between heaven and earth. So there's always this tension and this needed connection between heaven and earth, between God and humanity. So that's what we're moving toward. And all the Jewish people understood that that was going to happen at some point. This rabbi came along from Galilee, and he started saying, the kingdom of heaven is here. The kingdom of heaven is among you. The kingdom of heaven is within you. He's talking like this thing is imminent. This thing that you've been waiting for, the advent of it is with my coming, heaven is crashing into earth. Now, they thought that meant that he would go to Jerusalem and kill all the Romans and set up his throne, and this new age would be realized. By the way, there's this really weird story in Matthew about when Jesus is resurrected from the dead. Matthew says that some graves burst open and some dead people get up and walk around. What does that mean? That's just a really kind of cryptic, mysterious story. Well, part of that is that Matthew is saying this thing that you're waiting for, it's happening with Jesus. The early Christians began to live that way. Their sense was, I'm a citizen of heaven, yet living on this earth. It began with Jesus, but it hasn't reached its completion yet. We're living as citizens of the kingdom of God, but it's in this kind of in-between time. So what happens then to people who die in the in-between time? Well, like in 1 Corinthians, Paul goes into this analogy about how right now we're living in this earthly tent, and if it's destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Well, he's not talking about our mansion in heaven. He's talking about our bodies in heaven. See, Jewish people, they had a very strong concept of the body. There wasn't this idea that Plato had where the spirit leaves the body and leaves the body behind, and the body is sort of a bad thing to be discarded. And in Jewish thought, there's this strong idea that indeed the body will be resurrected and it will be redeemed. But Paul does acknowledge that there's this time when we leave this tent and we're away from the body. But he says this, we're confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So Paul acknowledges, yes, there's this temporary time when we are away from the body, but there is a part of us, call it the spirit, that is, if we're absent from the body, we're present with the Lord. So yes, if you die, now the Christian belief is not that you go to Sheol, okay, or to this holding place in paradise, but that you are in the presence of the Lord. In some kind of mystical way, still yet in a very real way, you're in the presence of the Lord. But Paul, his emphasis was not so much on that in-between state, but on the last day when the bodies would be resurrected and we would all be with the Lord together.
On earth?
On earth. Let me go to the passage that we read a lot of times.
Good gracious. It's getting deep on questioning Christianity.
Yeah.
My head's starting to hurt.
Yeah, mine too. And it's hot in here. You were asking a minute ago about, where did we come up with this idea of this disembodied state where we go to heaven? Christians have picked up on Platonic thought.
Yeah, I can see that.
That's been much more influential. And then we sort of superimpose that on Paul, but that's not what Paul said. Paul does acknowledge that there's this in-between time between the time we die and the last resurrection, the great resurrection. But then he addresses this problem that the early Christians were having when they were really concerned about what happened to their brothers and their sisters and their friends who died before that resurrection. And this is what Paul, let me read the passage from 1 Thessalonians. He said, brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be informed about those who sleep in death, so that you do not grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. For we believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so we believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep in him. According to the Lord's word, we tell you that we who are still alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. So here's the resurrection. After that, we who are still alive and left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will be with the Lord forever. Therefore, encourage one another with these words. Now, we've taken that to mean there's this thing called the rapture, and we're all caught up to meet the Lord in the air in heaven.
The air meaning heaven.
Yes, but that's not what Paul said. The idea here is this was a very common imagery for ancient people. When the king was coming back from being away from his kingdom, his subjects didn't wait for him to get back into town. They went out to meet him out on the boundaries of the kingdom. And then all together, everybody processioned back into the kingdom.
Okay.
So here's the idea that Paul is presenting. Not that we're going up into this place somewhere up in the sky to stay, but this final chapter is unfolding, and indeed heaven is coming down to earth, and we're meeting our Lord in the air. It's about the return to this state where God is once again with human beings, not somehow disconnected from them.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so that's Paul's understanding of it. And if we've got time, or if we need to, or if we're going to roll it over into another episode, we can look at one more scene in the book of Revelation, and we'll do that.
Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's jump to the end here of the book.
Dan's getting tired. But.
No. No. Like I said, my mind is getting tired because there's so much to think about, and truly there's a lot of things I'm really hearing for the first time, and I've got a list of questions here. We won't be able to get to all of them today, but we are truly talking about a revelation, this idea of heaven developing over the course of human history. And so I guess an appropriate place to wrap up is in the book of Revelation.
We get to this final scene, Revelation chapter 21, and the last book of the Bible is going to go back and reclaim the first book of the Bible, in a sense. Okay? And so John says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." Now, when John uses all this imagery, our tendency to literalize things will work against us here. For instance, if you're a beach person and you hear there's no longer any sea, you're not very happy right now. Well, in the ancient world, the sea was sort of this dark place, the abode of demonic forces, many believed. And so the passing away of the sea is the passing away of the dark realm, so to speak.
Okay.
So anyway, it says, "I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He'll wipe away every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" So there is this consummation, the old order of things, the way the world used to work. That order has passed away, and a new order has been established. It says, "He who was seated on the throne said, 'I'm making everything new.'" You'll note that he didn't say, "I'm making all new things." He said, "I'm making everything new. I'm recreating. What is already here is being redeemed and restored." So this is where we end up with this understanding of not us all living in some kind of way off on the other end of the universe, celestial city, that floats around on a big cloud or something, but this new heaven and new earth. You can let your imagination just kind of run wild with that. In another place I'll mention as quickly as I can, John has a vision of this great city that's 1,300 miles long, 1,300 miles wide and tall, like a big cube, which was roughly the geographical span of the Roman Empire. So what's the message there for the ones who first read this text? When God comes back, this whole space is going to be reclaimed. All the geographical territory that's now controlled by these dominant world leaders, that's going to be reclaimed, and heaven and earth are going to meet, and everything's going to be made new. And so that's the more biblical understanding of heaven.
Wow. All right. So where we are right now, then, heaven is here among us.
Yes.
Within us.
Yes.
When we die, a part of ourselves is with God.
Yes.
Ultimately, heaven and earth are going to come crashing together, and there will be some sort of resurrection. Again, the image is not this far off place of heaven, but it's all coming back here to earth.
Yes.
Such a dramatically different view than what I think many of us have been presented or visualized. And I've got all kinds of questions. We're not going to get into them tonight. I got questions about, well, what about aliens, and other planets and stuff, So this is where my brain's going.
Yeah, I don't know about all that stuff.
But what do we do with this information? What do we do with this broader perspective of the biblical definition, if that's the right word, of heaven? What do we do with this information?
Well, okay, one thing is, don't be afraid to let your imaginations sort of run with this information, I would say.
Okay.
Go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and use that imagery to think about what your place might be in this realm, where God has created and then he gives human beings great responsibility to govern this realm. And this is an interactive kind of experience. Creation is going to be ongoing, I believe. Jesus told a parable about a king who goes away and leaves his servants to invest his money, and the ones who do that wisely, he comes back and he says, "Oh, you've done pretty good with what I gave you. I'm going to put you in charge of 10 cities." This idea of human beings working under the guidance of our Creator to do all kinds of things that we've perhaps never even imagined. I know we've never imagined, in this beautiful, ongoing, unfolding, never-ending, creative kind of endeavor. I can't even begin, I don't think, to wrap my mind around it, or much less, guide somebody else in a mind experiment with it.
But it's not something we should worry about, though, is it? I mean, it's just something that we can have, let our imaginations go and have a little fun exploring it and thinking about it.
I think so.
I love C.S. Lewis. I thought of him as you were describing, using your imagination, and the Chronicles of Narnia, I think, are fantastic. And I think is the last book in that series, The Last Battle, where the main characters from all the books find themselves in a resurrected, England.
Yeah.
And you'll have to read the book, and I encourage you to do that. So I'm not going to summarize it, but it seems like I recall them saying it was like the old earth, but only more so.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I think about heaven, or heaven coming to earth, it's easy to get hung up on like the logistics. What about bodies that are in coffins? How are they going to get, it'd be like now, but more so or better, and so I find a little bit of peace in that. Otherwise I can get a little frustrated by some of these details.
I think we can let our imaginations have the freedom to kind of run with this stuff, and then at the same time acknowledge that we're never going to be able to wrap our minds around this. Instead of trying to nail down concrete stuff, I think we go back to this broad and beautiful language, like in the first chapter of Genesis, where God creates this thing and he says, well, that's good. Mm-hmm. And God creates this thing. He says, that's good. He gets it all created, and he looks at everything he's created and he says, that's very good. If the first chapter was very good, then the last chapter is going to be very good. And what is that going to mean when, for instance, we live in a world where we no longer draw battle lines or national boundaries and put on different uniforms and shoot at one another? That'll be very good.
Yeah.
And all these things that we can sort of begin to imagine that are going to eventually somehow become a reality.
Let us know what you think. We're going to be playing harps or tennis. I don't know what the options are there. We would like to hear your feedback, your questions, your criticisms about today's topic. And you can do that through our Facebook page or on our website, questioningchristianitypodcast.com. If you found this episode helpful, please share it and share it with just one friend this week. That would be great. And subscribe if you haven't already done so. That way you'll get a notification when our next episode comes out. And so until that time, I'm Dan McClellan. He's Rob Helton, and we'll see you later on the Questioning Christianity podcast.